Good evening and welcome to another edition with Live with Dr. Wendy. We're pleased to have you tonight. And it is finally summertime. I feel like we've waited for so long. But unfortunately, it is not all fun in the sun. And before I get into that, I'm going to be discussing that with my colleague Larry Dersham, who's an attorney and constitutional law expert, and really with me almost every week talking about some of these difficult issues. And, we hate to bring you bad news each week, which is one of the reasons we always end with a silver lining. But the country is off to a violent start in many places. And in some places, including New York City, they're asking whether they really have to choose between stop and frisk and duck and cover. That's a false choice, I believe. But that is because over July 4th weekend, people weren't just shooting off fireworks, they were shooting each other. 64 people were shot in New York City. Now, 10 of those shot, including a young father who was crossing a street with a 6-year-old, died. And for the first time since 2016, the city surpassed 400 shootings in the first half of the year. Now, those statistics are very disheartening and not the kind of statistics we wanted to read after 4th of July weekend. We're hearing that murders are up across the country this year, while other violent crimes have decreased, according to data. But in New York City alone, I hate that we keep coming back to New York City. It has been nearly a quarter century since gun violence in June was as high as it was, even though statistics show that oftentimes homicides generally rise in the summer. And I mean, Larry, do we need to go any further with what we saw today?
Not really, Wendy. What we saw today, I look at it as we are having two pandemics. We're having the COVID-19 pandemic and we're having a gun violence pandemic. And get this, just between Friday afternoon, yesterday, and early this morning, the day of this show, right at this day, 5 people have been killed by gun violence in Chicago. That's another city where there's a lot of violence, including the 15-year-old boy. A total of 22 people, including the 5 killed, have been wounded by gunfire this afternoon in Chicago. And just last week in Chicago, for example, during the Independence Day weekend, at least 67 people were shot, 13 fatally, including a 7-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy. As high homicide rates continue to turn the Windy City into a war zone. And a month earlier, I'm just going to go back one more month, on May 31st, Chicago, still talking about that city, endured its bloodiest day in over 60 years when 18 people were killed and 45 wounded in a 24-hour period. And it's becoming like a war zone. And I want to tell you a brief, interesting story. I used to work for a company called LexisNexis. It's a big legal research computer firm. People do research using their online services. We went up to Chicago Kent Law School up in Chicago, downtown Chicago, a beautiful city. Oh my goodness, Chicago is a muscular, strong, amazing city. But we flew into the Midway Airport, which is not the big airport there in Chicago, but it still is a fairly large airport. And on our way back, after we were done with our business at Chicago Kent, there was somebody walking down the street with a big old handgun, and it wasn't in a holster.
Oh
And
my.
it wasn't in a belt. He was just waving that thing around. And as we drove by, and I had to do a double take, I said, really? It's kind of a dangerous city here. Well, it turns out in Chicago, and this is important to know, 75% of those murdered are Black. And 71% of the killers happen to be Black also. So I guess in Chicago, at least to the politicians there, Black lives don't seem to matter all that much. It seems like a little bit of hypocrisy, I guess I'm trying to say.
Well, Larry, one of the other things that we've been following in terms of all different types of protests that are going on around the nation is we are seeing a dangerous trend of people being in their cars and being surrounded by angry protesters. I mean, last month, when most of the country opened back up and we went back out into the world, the biggest question then on our minds was whether our cars would start. But today, amidst protests, blockages, angry crowds, people are worried about whether they can stop their cars in time to avoid dangerous conditions. I mean, think about it, especially if you live near a downtown area. filled with civil unrest. Cars are no longer safe spaces. I mean, what do you do if your car is surrounded by an angry mob? Obviously, the best plan is prevention. Avoid putting yourself into the situation. Well, here's a couple of tips. First of all, watch the news. Many protests and riots are publicized and planned. Stay away from the advertised locations. Now, if a flash mob happens together, if you have your eyes on the road, you will probably see people blocking the roadway. Now, if you have your radio down enough, you'll probably hear crowds and horns honking. These are loud events, some of these protests. Do what you need to do to avoid the area, change course. If you're alert, you should be able to turn around in enough time. Now, if you live in a hot spot, you want to keep that radio on to monitor potential problems. Think about what we've seen. People don't have their eyes on the road. They're not looking at what's going on in front of them. Sometimes they don't even hear police helicopters overhead, Larry. I know we've seen some of that. But here is the key that I know you and I always encourage people. Report it and let the investigators investigate it. Like we say, let the professionals do their job. But sometimes when we go through these segments, we think about the fact that we even have to be talking about this, which is already a defeat. But if you end up trapped and stranded in traffic, like many people have, we want to make sure you protect, first of all, yourself. That means you have water with you have food with you if you need it. Protect your senses. That means if you need hearing aids to hear, you have them with you. If you need glasses to see, we always like to say perception provides protection. For your health, I mean, how many times have you been somewhere you have to take medication on a regular basis and you just didn't bring it? If you need an inhaler, make sure you bring that. God forbid you are faced with areas where tear gas has been deployed. All these kinds of things that people think about. You know, one of the other things, Larry, and I think we talked about this last week, is carjacking. Do we need to tell everybody to lock their doors? But remember, some of the cases we've covered over the last couple of weeks have started exactly that way. So we're talking about access to escape as well. Now, when it comes to cell phones, keep your devices charged and maybe even carry your charger with you. How many times have you been on the phone with somebody that says, oh, wait a minute, my battery's about to die? Don't let that be you. Carry your power cords so you can plug them in the car. And with a working phone, if you see something, you can go ahead and report it. Now, one of the other things that we've seen, Larry, is these peaceful protesters that have themselves been victimized. Because if you're a peaceful protester, you're not just concerned about bullets flying. Guns are only one type of deadly weapon. We've seen all sorts of injuries from Molotov cocktails, knives, hatchets, and especially this week, dangerous drivers. A car is just that, another type of deadly weapon. And what is the latest on what is happening here? How can we protect those protesters?
Right. Yeah, I want to get into that, Wendy. But first, I wanted to tell you what I've been seeing on the internet. It's a real concerning trend. There's cases where groups surround cars, they block them, and then they even begin to try to break windows. They break windows of the cars and cut the seatbelts in the attempt to pull the drivers and the passengers out of those vehicles. In fact, Wendy, I don't know if you happen to see this on the a video circulating around the internet, where Antifa members are openly teaching viewers how to break car windows and cut seatbelts. They even tell you where you can purchase handy little tools to do this vehicle mayhem, even ones that are so small, they can be worn around your neck like a necklace. It's just quite amazing.
I've seen that.
Yeah, but you're right. It goes the other way too. So protesters are have to be protect themselves too, because cars are a deadly weapon. Of course, if people are angry and they point those cars at you. And in recent days, I know there was one person killed in Seattle. 2 people were injured in another state, in the city of Bloomington, Indiana, where dozens of similar incidents are occurring across the United States. Over there in Bloomington, a driver of a red Toyota first stopped and then unexpectedly accelerated into the crowd of dispersing demonstrators. And that just happened Monday night. It injured 2 of them. And again, this is just one of the trends that we're seeing now.
And
so I think people are very short tempered. They're very anxious right now on both sides.
Right. They've been like dry tinder waiting for a spark. And remember, a car is just another type of deadly weapon that you don't need a background check or even a license for that matter to operate.
Okay.
So we really do care about that. And, you know, it's one of these things we just really hope everything calms down and we're able to actually we always bring good news in the second half, and we're going to do that here too. It's not all bad news. So stay with us for the second half, where we're going to be joined by the real deal, a primetime threat assessment expert, to give us some good news about how we can prevent crime at the community level. Remember, we always say we're the eyes and ears of the police, the civilian coalition. You don't want to miss it. So stay with us. You're on Live with Dr. Wendy. Back in a flash. Good evening and welcome back to another edition of Live with Dr. Wendy. So, in the first half of the show, what have we learned? We've established we live in dangerous times. But now, in line with our commitment to bring you news you can use, I am delighted to be joined by someone who literally stops mass shootings and targeted violence for a living. How is that for a job description? Dr. Russ Palarea is the founder and president of Operational Psychology Services and an internationally recognized expert on threat assessment, and president of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, where he has been a great role model for me and others in leading the organization. But in terms of Hollywood star power, Russ worked as a consultant on one of my favorite TV shows, NCIS Los Angeles, with LL Cool J and Chris O'Donnell, in connection with the operational psychologist character on the show, Dr. Nate Getz. Do you remember him? Maybe Russ will tell me about that some other time. Welcome, Russ, to the show. Well, as we cover the almost weekly roundup of shootings, stabbings, or other acts of violence, we're continually reminded of the important role of the community in preventing crime. They're the civilian coalition, the eyes and ears of law enforcement, and threat managers. How can we increase community-based crime prevention programs? No, that's absolutely true. And, you know, I hope everybody is listening to this, because that's one of the things we can do collectively as a community. And once a threat is detected, now we know it's experts like you who manage dangerous people, sometimes for years, because you never shred a file in threat assessment work. But particularly now in pandemic times, since we know that people don't snap, if we observe someone nursing a grievance on what seems to be a slow burn, how do we fashion pro-social interventions to prevent them from resorting to violence?
Uh-huh. Right?
No, that's true. That's also good advice. And when we're looking at some of the most key words that I know that you talk about in threat assessment, motivation and intent, if we don't see these people as much as we should, whether it's family, friends, we're not getting out, they're not present on Zoom calls for whatever reason, how are we really able to assess how they're doing when we don't have the kind of access to them as we otherwise might? Oh, that's such great advice. Hey, Larry, you had a question for Russ about what ATAP does.
Right. I believe, Russ, that's the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. Yeah. What is that organization all about? What do you do? You said it was based in LA. Can other parts of the country use your services like Washington, D.C. and so forth? Okay.
And Russ speaks to them all over the world. And Larry, the most you have to worry about is your clients threatening to sue each other. So as a estate planning lawyer, hopefully you'll never need Dr. Palarea's services. I have
Okay.
to end with this question. I imagine you find this as frustrating as I do, and it comes up all the time. What do you say to people who mistakenly believe there's no way to stop mass shootings or targeted violence? That's excellent advice. Thank you so much. Before we segue to our weekly silver lining segment and shift the discussion from threats to pets, We want to thank our guests. We've been talking with Dr. Russ Palarea, founder and president of Operational Psychology Services and president of the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals. Russ, thank you for all you do to protect the rest of us and make this world a safer place. Oh, well, thanks for being a great mentor and role model for me and everybody else. Okay, Larry, we're going to shift to our canine COVID delivery segment, but frankly, I don't know if we can top that last segment with Dr. Palarea. Maybe we should just quit while we're ahead. I feel like we had such a silver lining in terms of such valuable information about how we can protect our communities. I mean, one of the things that Dr. Palarea reminded us of is that there are resources out there that we can look at, that we can read, that we can refer our friends to when they ask us, how in the world do you people think you can possibly band together and prevent some of these things? I mean, I know Dr. Palarea has personally prevented some. Everybody can if you all play your role in the system. Don't you agree, Larry?
Totally, yes, absolutely. I think there's a time as we're in right now. There's no better time to learn about threats and threat assessment, how to avoid threats, how to de-escalate, and so forth. I don't think there's been a better time, a more needed time in our entire history of our country.
Yeah, and I
right
think
now.
I think that last segment was our silver lining. That was so inspiring. Yeah. You know, it really kind of rounds out this segment of there really is something we can do, and there is a reason to be hopeful. There are resources, there are people that can do things that are just community members like you and I that can actually be a part of the process. So we're going to leave it there this week because we want to end strong. And please join us next week for another segment of Live with Dr. Wendy. I guarantee we will have both good news and bad news, but it will always be news you can use. God bless you. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will see you next week. You're on Live with Dr. Wendy.